Upon hearing of the surrender at Yorktown, Lord Frederick North's government, remember he's the Prime Minister, already damaged by the decision to allow Irish Catholics to enlist in the army, suffered even more. By early 1782 a vote of no confidence was taken against the Prime Minister, forcing him and the rest of the Tory leadership to resign. The Whigs, who had grown as the opposition party, won the elections that followed and would now be in control of the British Parliament, and therefore peace negotiations. Battles, though, did continue at sea, in Europe, in India, and in the Caribbean, the 4 other theaters of war that the British were fighting in, mostly against the French, the Dutch, and the Spanish. Finally, though, the government decided enough was enough, and they began negotiations for a cessation of hostilities. With the opening of discussions, British troops in America would be restricted from launching further offensive actions. The treaty that resulted would recognize American independence, rather than making America part of the Dominion, and would grant them all of the land east of the Mississippi River, north of Florida, and south of Quebec, which, remember, the United States originally had wanted, and had wanted to claim as spoils of war, but were unable to do so. The Americans would also be granted access to the rich Newfoundland fishery off the coast. France would gain an island in the Caribbean as well as Senegal in Africa, while the Spanish would get possession of Florida. It would take until September of 1783 for all of the terms of the treaty to be worked out, with the war formally being declared over on September 3rd of that year. The last British troops would leave New York in November. The total loss of life throughout the conflict is largely unknown. As was typical in the wars of the era, diseases such as smallpox claimed more lives than battle. Between 1775 and 1782, there was a smallpox epidemic that broke out throughout North America, killing 40 people in Boston alone. Historian Joseph Ellis suggests that Washington's decision to have his troops inoculated against the disease was probably one of the most important decisions he made during the course of the entire war. It is estimated that between 25,000 and 70,000 American patriots died during active military service. Of these, approximately 6,800 were killed in battle, while at least 17,000 died from disease. The majority of the latter died while prisoners of war, held in British prison ships, often in the New York harbor. If the upper limit of 70,000 is accepted as the total net loss for the Patriots, it would actually make the conflict proportionally deadlier than the Civil War 8 decades later. In addition, though, the United States had accumulated a debt of nearly $75 million, and its paper money had become nearly worthless. But they were free of the control of the British Parliament. They were an independent nation. And now they would need to learn to effectively govern their vast territory. We'll now begin our look at the establishment of the new governments and the early years of this new republic. Once the war had changed from fighting for their rights to a war for independence, many things would now have to be done, including creating new governments for each of the former colonies, as well as a national government. As the war itself was going on, the states were simultaneously creating constitutions and determining how each of them would be governed. This new American nation was going to be created following republican ideals, whereby citizens would be represented by legislators who would make the major decisions for them. Of course, citizens really translated into white male landowners. What they were creating was a representative democracy, something that hadn't existed since the times of the ancient Greeks and Romans. The key thing was, though, that they were trying to find a balance between liberty and power. They wanted to make sure that this new American governments protected the rights of the individuals as well as the rights of the states from being violated by a national government. Therefore, you would have both state constitutions, creating state governments, as well as a national government. By 1777, most of the states had written constitutions, a written framework for government that was going to be unique to each state, although they actually all shared some common items. For example, each state constitution included a list of rights and basic freedoms that would belong to all citizens. Each of them provided for a separation of powers, limiting what each part of the government could do. They all had a legislative body whose members were elected and made laws, an executive who was elected as governor instead of being royally appointed or appointed by even the legislature, who enforced the laws, and a judiciary, or a system of courts that would interpret the laws and apply them. Typically, the power of governors was fairly weak, and the powers of the legislatures were fairly strong. These state constitutions would also include provisions for who was allowed to vote and who was allowed to hold office. Generally, it was white men who owned a certain amount of property or wealth, although office holders typically had the same basic concept, but they usually required more land or more wealth, somewhat stricter requirements. In addition to the governments created by the states, the Second Continental Congress drew up a plan for a national government, largely written by John Dickinson of Pennsylvania. They had a draft of the Articles of Confederation, the earliest draft, completed in July of 1776, but really it took until March of 1781 until all 13 states approved the final version, which actually took over 18 months to create. Once all 13 states approved the Articles of Confederation, the new government could begin functioning. Until then, the Second Continental Congress was the de facto government of the United States. The states who had no western frontier were the ones that held out the longest on their approval of the document, with the dispute being over how to handle the division of the vast amount of land located west of the Appalachian Mountains. Once all of the other states gave up their claims to this land, or promised that they would, only then was the Articles of Confederation ratified, really in just the final months of the war. The government that was created by the Articles of Confederation was a Congress and was really a loose association of states who, of course, were highly protective of their liberties and often at odds with one another. The Confederation Congress was purposefully weak in order to ensure that it did not violate the rights of the 13 states or of the citizens. Since the war was really largely over by the time this Confederation Congress was approved and functioning, its weaknesses had not yet come to light. Now, it could approve treaties with other nations, but it didn't have any power to enforce their terms. It did not have an executive or a judiciary. The Treaty of Paris, which the government under the Articles officially negotiated, had required the new United States to pay its debts, including debts that were owed to British merchants, as well as loyalists who'd had property confiscated over the course of the war. But with the Congress not having the power to tax, and because most of the states were reluctant to give money, to give contributions to this national government, the Confederation Congress was often short of cash. Of course, they could print money, but the money that they printed had virtually no value. Basically, the Articles of Confederation reflected the fears of the Americans towards a monarchy that had grown too powerful. They distrusted large governments, and even having, too much power vested in the hands of one individual, which is why they didn't have a president or other executive. The Congress would have power over foreign affairs and resolving interstate disputes, but with no judicial system, there was really very little way for them to enforce their own laws. And since they didn't have the power to tax citizens, they simply had to ask the states for funding, but states often ignored those requests. For certain important laws, 9 of the 13 states would be needed to approve. And for any changes to the Articles themselves, you would need unanimous consent, all 13 states voting in favor. And remember, the states are very different from one another. The national government would also not be able to regulate interstate or even foreign trade. Any tariffs that would be imposed would require the approval of all the states, and southern states tended to dislike tariffs, although northern states tended to like them. For all its weaknesses, though, the government under the Articles was the one that negotiated that very favorable Treaty of Paris in 1783.